Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.
Market Journal, Television for Agricultural Business Decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Kate Brooks looks at cattle markets. Jerry Volesky updates us on pasture and range conditions. Charles Shapiro outlines his long-term research on crop rotation and no-till. And Fred Whitford explains why simple things like water quality and tank size can significantly impact your weed control efforts. Nebraska Extension livestock economist Kate Brooks is our cattle market analyst this week. The price for all fresh retail beef reached a new record in July, averaging $6.16 per pound. Ground beef, however, fell 2 cents from the previous month to average $4.20 a pound. July's cattle on feed report showed placements and marketings were the lowest for that month since the data series began in 1996, and the agency's cold storage report showed a sizable increase from a year ago. We talked with Kate at the Goodmanson Sandhills Lab open house Wednesday near Whitman and started by looking at current price levels.
You know, as we've go back the whole entire year, if we look at prices throughout 2015, we started really strong there above 2014 levels. As we've come through August, we're starting to hit those 2014 levels where they continue to rise, and we're not seeing those increases here in 15. Maybe actually start to see some declines as we continue through August and even into September, October.
Reasoning behind that?
There's a lot of things going on. We're going to start to see more calves coming into the market. Part of that's just because we are rebuilding the herd, starting to see more calves hit the ground. Probably not as many this year as we will see next year, but there's also some macroeconomic issues going on as well. But just overall starting to go back to that normal seasonal price cycle.
Let's take a look at some of last week's report. First of all, cattle on feed, record low placements and marketings for the month of July. What does that mean?
We've continued to see cattle numbers to continue to decline. It's just another scenario in it all. As we look at marketings, we're bringing cattle in at higher placement weights, and so we're holding those longer, so that's delaying some of those marketings. But we're also just, in the industry as a whole, we're delaying a lot of those calves coming into the cattle on feed report as we're delaying them going into the feedlots, trying to, keep them out on pastures or add weight outside of the feedlot.
One of the things you talked about today was beef cow replacements and trying to build up the cow herd. Outline for me where that is and where that goes for the rest of the year and even into 2016.
Right, so we've continued to build the herd. As we looked at the January 1 inventory report, we saw increases in cow numbers, we saw increases in replacement numbers. If we look at statewide, we saw big increases in Oklahoma and Texas. As we move to the July 1 report, we don't get it state by state, but as a U.S. as a whole, we saw increases in the cow numbers again. It just reaffirmed that January 1 report that we are rebuilding. We saw the third highest replacement heifer number year over year for the last, since early 1990s.
That holds, though. You believe that it will continue? There's nothing alarming that would say, no, it's not going to?
No, we still have a lot of profitability potential for cow-calf herds. That brings about a lot of opportunity to continue to expand these herds. We've got pasture, we have hay, so all of that brings into good weather conditions to continue to see expansion in the next couple years.
Let's talk about demand. So last week's cold storage report showed beef in freezers up 24% over a year ago. How alarming is that?
There's a lot of things going on in cold storage, and we're seeing a lot of increases in cold storage numbers. Some of that's because of declines in our export markets. We're also holding calves to a little bit heavier weights, so that's increasing beef production this year over last year. So there's a lot of factors going on. The big thing with the export side is if we're not exporting it, then we've got to absorb that product here in the U.S.
And are the consumers willing to do that?
Well, that's the question. You know, the big thing will be, you know, as we increase supplies here in the U.S., prices will eventually go down for the consumer, or at least stabilize for a while.
How do the competing meats, chicken and pork, play into that game as well?
You know, that's all a big factor. You know, as we look at beef in general, you know, we don't eat beef as often as we used to. So, you know, as prices continue to go up, some consumers weren't willing to switch away from beef if they were only eating it once a week, once a month, you know, depending on what it was. So they were still eating pork and chicken, but we didn't see a lot of that substitution away from those high beef prices. But as we continue to see increases in production in chicken and pork, again, you know, more supplies in the U.S. means cheaper meat prices.
All right, so foreign demand, let's talk about that. And you mentioned exports. What do you expect for the strength of the dollar and therefore how that will impact exports?
Right, so we've seen the U.S. dollar continuing to strengthen, higher beef prices. So for beef industry, we've seen, you know, some pullback a little bit on the export market, not being able to export just because it becomes more and more expensive for those countries. And then, you know, if they're devaluing their currency as well as we're seeing some countries do, that also offsets, you know, some of that export market availability.
Let's look at margins as we close out. First, tell me where margins you think will be in this area for cow-calf producers.
You know, where exactly the margins will be for cow-calf producers, you know, the LMIC is predicting, you know, on average in the U.S. somewhere around that $480, $490 per head returns. You know, there's a lot of strength here in Nebraska. We have a little bit higher calf prices, you know, so there's potential there for those returns here in Nebraska as well.
Flip side in the feedlot?
The margins are a lot tighter on the feedlot side. So, you know, as we go forward, you know, the margins there, we're placing cattle a lot heavier weights, so trying to put some cheap feed into them and get them to heavier weights, the margin's not there like it was for sure in 2014.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. The USDA has lowered its forecast for 2015 net farm income. The agency said Tuesday it expects that number, $58.3 billion, will be 36% lower than last year. Its previous estimate was 32% below 2014. If realized, this would be the lowest net farm income since 2006. Adjusted for inflation, it would be the smallest since 2002. It would also be nearly 53% below the record farmers set in 2013. Next week, Tina Barrett from Nebraska Farm Business Inc. will join us to look at costs of production for Nebraska producers. Adequate moisture across Nebraska has led to the second straight week of no drought classification for the state. Last week marked the first time in more than 4 years that no portion of Nebraska was in either drought or abnormally dry conditions. That last happened July 26, 2011. The most recent USDA ratings of Nebraska's pasture and ranges are also unchanged from a week ago, with 67% in good to excellent shape. In the Sandhills at the Goodmanson Open House Wednesday, we asked Nebraska Extension's Jerry Volesky for an update on pastures and ranges in central Nebraska.
Well, things are looking pretty good throughout central and western Nebraska as far as the range and pasture conditions. Although some areas the last couple of weeks it's been a little bit dry or more scattered rainfall showers throughout the area. But you know, at this time of year, most of our grass production has been made already or has completed its growth. So things are looking really good.
One of the things you're presenting on today is weed control and weed management in ranges and pastures. Tell me where that stands right now.
Well, when it comes to the pasture and range weeds, there's a lot of different species that can cause problems for the producers. That varies the part of the state you're located in or the type of rangeland or pasture land you're dealing with. And each year too, there seems to be something different that's more, as far as the weeds go, that are more abundant one year than they were the year before. And so we really emphasize a couple of things with our weed management programs. First, these producers really have to know what they're dealing with. What's the weed species that's causing them the most problems? And with that, that is important because there's different strategies as far as the control. If they're using herbicides, they need to know what species they're dealing with, and then they can apply the herbicide at the correct time of year.
Any species that are causing problems this year?
Well, I think personally I've seen a greater abundance of the some of the noxious weeds like the Canada thistle, the musk thistle, some of our native species of weeds like western ragweed, for example, very common throughout the sandhills. It seems to have done very well this year.
What about production for the rest of the summer and going into fall? What should producers be aware of as they think about taking those cattle off the range?
Well, most people that I've been visiting with in terms of their normal summer pasture rotation, that's gone very well. The abundance of grass to them seemed to result in, as they move to a new pasture, they seem to have plenty of pasture or grass left in the pasture they were grazing. But I say that's okay. I mean, leaving an adequate amount of residue or remaining grass in that pasture is just a good practice that benefits the vigor and health of those grasses.
What was production like overall this year, would you say?
Probably definitely above average, I guess. We do production numbers from a number of different rangeland areas, and haven't got the numbers all finalized yet, but definitely above average in terms of our grass production.
As for next year's production, Jerry says we won't really know if output will be more or less until rainfall events in April, May, and June. The August Nebraska farmer says variability is one of the few certain things in agriculture. That's especially the case in Nebraska this year when some areas saw record amounts of rainfall. This month's issue says there's always a learning curve with new technology, but when well managed, technology like variable rate seeding can help producers get a handle on this unpredictability. In the August Nebraska Farmer, you can read how Russ Robertson and Robertson Ridge Farms in Lancaster County use technology like variable rate seeding along with historical yield and soil data to manage this spatial variability. Spanning nearly 30 years, a team of researchers at the Haskell Ag Lab in northeast Nebraska has been looking at the long-term effect of tillage, nitrogen rates, and crop rotation. While alternating corn and soybeans has proven to be a clear winner, Nebraska Extension soil scientist Charles Shapiro says on average the difference between no-till and plowing has yielded only a difference of 5 bushels per acre. We talked with Charles last month at his research plots near Concord to learn more about the ongoing study.
Well, back in the mid-1980s, we were interested in the long-term effect of plowing versus not plowing. No-till was just coming into its own, so we wanted to establish a study where we could look at tillage, nitrogen rate, rotation, and then, as it's turned out, we've been doing it for 29 years now.
For some background, how would you describe the soil, the ground that we're working on here?
This is very fertile soil. You can't see it from your camera there, but around us we have hills and there's been a lot of erosion. So this is not your typical northeast Nebraska Crofton Nora soil. This is a deep soil. It probably goes 4 feet for the most part, and it's 3.5 to 4% organic matter. So there are a number of creek bottoms that have soil like this, but it's not what they call the buskin hills that are eroded.
Let's start looking at crop rotation. What have you seen in all these years of research?
Following these soybeans gives us anywhere from 20 to 30 bushels consistently from year in, year out. In dry years, it's less. In good years, it's about that 30 bushels. So, other studies don't show quite as good a rotation effect, but it's been tremendous down here.
But you are seeing a big hit when you go corn on corn.
Yeah, it's definitely a big hit. We probably, like I say, lose 20 bushels.
What about the rates of nitrogen that you're applying?
You need more nitrogen when you go continuous corn compared to corn following soybeans. In fact, our zero rate of nitrogen on the corn following soybeans is almost as high as what the full nitrogen rate is on the continuous corn. They're only off by about 10 bushels.
What kind of yields could you see, in those years, or I guess in all of those years when you're not applying any nitrogen?
Well, our long-term average for the zero rate is 95 bushels. So, that's over 29 years of no nitrogen. And they look green, they look pale green and yellow some years, but these soils, I figure about 20 pounds per percent organic matter is being pumped out of them year in and year out.
As you look at the many years you have in this study, so does it show you that there's a clear winner between either applications of nitrogen or crop rotation?
Well, we definitely have a nitrogen rate effect, especially on the continuous corn. The data here shows that corn-soybean rotation will give us our biggest yield. Probably from a farmer point of view, they're concerned about the tillage factor. no-till versus disc. No one plows every year. That's kind of an anachronism, and we certainly aren't promoting it. But when we started the study, we wanted to go from no disturbance of soil to completely turning over the soil. So we have, you know, the extremes. So really, the farmer's probably interested in the disc versus the no-till.
Why is it so beneficial to have more than 20 years of data on the books?
Well, we can look at years of dry, years of wet. We've had a lot of different years over types of weather. In 2012, when it was really dry, the no-till yielded 65 bushels. And the plow, we had a hunt for an ear and it yielded about 8 bushels. So, you know, that's an extreme. But if we're going to have extreme weather in the future, we also have extreme wet conditions. So what we're doing with the data now is trying to look at each set of years, wet years, dry years, and certainly the no-till does a lot better in the dry years.
Charles says the big data set can provide a larger scope for comparison. With crop rotation, for example, the only times corn on corn performed better than rotation were in the drier years of 1989 and 2012. We've talked many times on this show about the continuing battle with weed resistance. Nebraska has 8 weed species that are resistant to at least one group of herbicides and 6 weeds resistant to glyphosate. But as you may have heard if you attended one of last week's soybean management field days, sometimes what you think is resistance isn't always resistance. Purdue University's Fred Whitford says things like water quality, consistent product measurements, and even a sprayer tank size could be misleading farmers when it comes to adequate weed control.
A lot of us think we're applying full rates. And we apply full rates and we notice that, you know, out here you don't see very many weeds, but you apply full rates and we don't get control. So there's something, they're resistant. Something's wrong. Well, what we're showing the group here today at the field day is a lot of our poly tanks, fiberglass, and steel tanks are mismeasured. So we had one example in here of a farmer who had a 750-gallon tank, and in fact, it was actually, you remember what it was?
It was 850, I think.
850, very good. So what he did was he mixed up enough chemical for that 750 gallons, but he actually spread it over 850. The tank was mismeasured. We had a Nebraska farmer here this week tell us that one of his 1,600-gallon tank was 375 gallons off. And so the key here is I've got to get that tank down because we based our rates on the volume of the tank.
You said the reasoning is because of how it's made, yes?
That's correct. It's just an art. It's an art making poly tanks.
Okay, so how do we fix this problem?
That's pretty easy. So we talked about some of the guys here doing flow meters to verify how much is in the tank, and then other ones that we kind of pushed was that if you had a sprayer in a tank, I would go to the local ag retailer, I'd weigh it out. I would let's say it's a 1,000-gallon tank. I would add 1,000 gallons of water to it. Water weighs 8.345, and so that's what should be in it. The one that had 100 and whatever it was, 50 gallons more, that's 150 times 8.345 more weight than what I should have had. That's the first signs that my tanks are off. And if my tanks are off, I don't know what I'm doing out in the fields.
Let's move into measurement. What are we doing wrong in measurement?
Measurement is, we believe so much in technology, that our equipment, our machines, everything is perfect, and we don't have to worry about it. It's all mechanical. So what we do know is a number of different things, and we had them here. We don't mix dry material in a fluid ounce cup. Liquid ounces and dry ounces are different. That's the first one. People don't believe it. Well, 16 ounces in a pound, 128 ounces in a gallon. They're different. We talked about these tubes being very inaccurate on the dry tubes, and it says it on the tube. What we'd like the growers to do is to get that plus or minus, and you saw in here up to 25% wrong on these dry tubes. Every tube, 7.5, 10, 15, 25. We don't want to be on average, we want to be correct. So we were pushing the little $50 to $100 scales, so every time a grower goes out here to spray, take care of his crop, he's putting on exactly the right amount. We had problems with some of the growers here taking one dry tube for a product and using that tube to measure all products. Those tubes are specific for the product that you're using. And then lastly, the big push here is these tubes change even for the same product. When you're done with the box, take that tube and adios she goes, because the next box has a tube in it that could have changed. Don't take that tube and keep reusing it, even if it's for the same product.
Finally, water. Why can water affect what you do and how you spray?
Okay, good question. What we talked about, the tank and the measuring are the basics. And that's going to give me a certain level of control of weeds, insects, diseases. What we're trying to do with water is to push that rate that we're controlling up another 5%, 6%, whatever, 10%, I'm making it up. So water has two things: hardness, minerals, calcium, magnesium. Everybody knows if you use glyphosate, you need to add ammonium sulfate. What happens is the calcium and magnesium ties up the glyphosate, it doesn't work. We add ammonium sulfate to keep the Roundup in the water, the glyphosate. So that's water, and then the other one was pH. Most of our chemicals probably prefer to be in the acid under 7, and that's a concept. And if you noticed here, what we did was we had a swimming pool test kit that everybody uses to test swimming pools. You can actually test your water, and you can measure the pH and hardness, and then you can make a determination if you have to clean your water up. And I guess the last big message was there's some products that tell you to add a surfactant to spread it, and there's some products that ask you to add an oil to help penetrate into the leaves. If your label says it, you got to use it. If you're not going to add the adjuvants, oils, surfactants, then don't use the product. Get you another one that doesn't require it, because you're not going to be happy with the performance of that herbicide if you don't do what the manufacturer asks you to do.
We'll have more from the Soybean Management Field Day next week when we look at costs of production with Tina Barrett. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, we've seen the heat build back into western Nebraska. Relatively cool conditions here in eastern Nebraska, although we started to see the warmth move in during the latter half of the week. And of course, we've seen the thunderstorm development, particularly as we got into Thursday morning and through Friday morning, where we had thunderstorm development move across extreme northeastern Nebraska with some isolated pockets Thursday morning in eastern Nebraska, and then overall we had that broad-based widespread precipitation move from central Nebraska through the eastern part of the state during the overnight hours into Friday morning. And then if we went into last weekend, of course, we had that cold front that pushed through that brought the cooler area into eastern Nebraska. We actually had some reports of scattered frost in the northern Black Hills and then up into portions of western South Dakota, western North Dakota, and the front range of the Rockies in the Montana region. So it's a reminder that we're getting closer and closer to that eventual first freeze of the year. There is nothing really coming down the pipeline that we can see, at least in the immediate future. But the one thing that we did notice over this last couple of weeks was exceptionally cool conditions invaded a good broad portion of the upper Midwest, including Nebraska, where we ran anywhere from 6 degrees below normal to 10 degrees below normal on average temperatures, and that actually pushed back our expected development or maturity of our corn crop. We've been tracking this now for the past month, and initial suggestions were indicating the last 2 weeks of September for the vast majority of the corn crop actually got pushed back 4 or 5 days due to this cool weather. Now, as we go through the next 2 weeks, it looks like much above normal temperatures that'll probably offset the cool conditions that we've seen, because it does appear that average temperatures will remain in the area of 6 to maybe even up to 12 degrees above normal over this next 7 to 10 day period, and we should pretty much balance things out. So again, we're still projecting most of the crop will mature during the latter half of September. The only item that we do worry about is some of the late plant or replant corn that may be pushing the threshold in the middle of maturity to the middle of October, which will put us in to that 50-50 freeze risk, especially if you're in the northern half of the state. Now, as we go through this next 7 day period, of course, we had the precipitation move through. It does look like a warming conditions will start to build in across the Midwest, and that will expand toward the eastern United States. And we don't really see a lot of significant moisture until we get into the latter half of next week. So let's take a look at the upper end models and see how this is going to play out. Once again, we have this broad-based ridge that's going to build in, and that's going to bring the heat basically from the southwest, from the southern plains up into the central United States. We'll be looking at conditions here in eastern Nebraska that will be slightly cooler than western Nebraska, as we are on the front side of this ridge that will slowly expand toward the east. So we'll be looking at consistently probably upper 80s today across northern Nebraska, particularly northeast Nebraska, eastern Nebraska. As we get into western Nebraska, we'll be looking well into the lower to mid 90s. As we go into tomorrow, we'll see that that ridge starts to expand toward the east. You'll notice this trough up in the Pacific Northwest. It doesn't really do much here for the next few days as it remains parked because of this high blocking it. And as we get into Monday, again, that ridge starts to slowly slide, and we will probably be looking at temperatures approaching the upper 90s in the western part of the state, particularly in the northern half of the Panhandle, and the low 90s will be consistent across the eastern part of the state. There is some outside precipitation showing up inside the models, very isolated across the Panhandle as some of this monsoon moisture makes its way into the Panhandle. More importantly, as we get into Tuesday, it does appear that this ridge will sag far enough eastward to allow us a little bit of the cooler air from the Pacific Northwest into the northern Panhandle, and that may generate some isolated scattered thunderstorm activity during the overnight hours, and it will carry that into Wednesday with the shift of the precipitation more into central Nebraska, but again, it's going to be very isolated. The hurricane that was down in the southeastern United States, depending on the models, is going to come in somewhere between Florida and Cape Hatteras. The big question is this going to come inshore, or is this going to curve toward the Atlantic and just basically brush the eastern United States? Stay tuned, because it will change rather dramatically as we go through the next couple days. Now, as we get into Thursday, we'll start to see this trough making its way toward our region. That's going to push some of the scattered thunderstorm activity into eastern Nebraska, but again, it's going to be isolated. And as we get into Friday, we'll be looking at more of that energy coming into our region as the risk shifts to our east. As we look at the temperature forecast, you can see very warm conditions for pretty much the entire state, much above normal, with that scattering of thunderstorm activity. As we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast next Thursday through the following Tuesday, the warm conditions continue, and in terms of precipitation, we are looking at normal to above normal moisture.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, pasture conditions in central Nebraska, corn and soybean research in northeast Nebraska, and tips for more effective weed control. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Jeff Peterson will analyze corn and soybean markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.